Welcome back to another episode of Wrong Sports, and when you think about college football rivalries, you might think about Army-Navy, because it's one of the longest rivalries in college football. It has been going on for over 100 years, and it's one of the biggest games on the calendar, no matter if these teams are winners or not. And this game was especially big during World War II, mostly due to Army, because of all the winning they were doing during the tail end of World War II, mostly due to a few guys on their team. That's what I'll be covering in this deep dive series. Usually in my deep dive series I cover losing streaks, but this time I'm going to be covering winning streaks, and the winning streak by the Army football team from 1944 until 1947. It's going to be a long one. That's why this is going to be 3 parts, so make sure you hang out with me. As always, make sure you subscribe to the channel, please, and ring the bell below so you can get reminders on when I'm going to be dropping each part of this episode, and it's going to be coming out every week over the next 3 weeks. And as always, check me out on Twitter @SportsWrong, and go to my Patreon, patreon.com/wrongsports to help me out there. And let's get to it. Now to start, I'm going to have to give you a little history lesson on Army football, except I'm not going to start all the way at the beginning. I'm going to start in 1941 with the hiring of Earl Blaik. Earl Blaik played football first at Miami of Ohio from 1915 to 1917, then went into World War I to Army and played there, becoming a third-team All-American. Blaik wouldn't leave football and instead be an assistant at his alma mater, Miami of Ohio, after the war, before heading back to Army to be an assistant there from 1927 to 1933. Blaik made himself one of the top assistants in the country towards the early 1930s, and that allowed him to get his first head coaching job at Dartmouth in 1934. Blaik showed that he was a top-notch coach, as he had a winning record in each of his first 7 seasons at Dartmouth. After 7 seasons, Blaik had a record of 45, 15, and 4 before he got a call from the Army to come back and coach the football team. Blaik got to work in 1941, taking over a team that had 2 losing records and started with a 4-0-1 record, including tying number 6 Notre Dame in New York City, and Army would be 5-3-1 in his first year, then improved to 6-3 in 1942, but lose to Notre Dame and Navy by shutouts. Blaik was looking to make his team better, but it was tough with the war going on, and just after the 1942 season, the USA would lower the draft age from 21 to 18. This was a major shift, as many college athletes were now eligible and would be drafted, which would deplete many rosters from schools all around the country. As many as 100 colleges around the country, with some big schools like Stanford, Alabama, Tennessee, would suspend their team during the wartime, but the West Point football team was actually going to be on the chopping block, as the famed General George C. Marshall wrote a letter to the West Point superintendent saying he liked football as a morale positive, but that during the war, West Point should have their efforts directed away from football and, towards the war effort. But for whatever reason, Marshall never sent that letter, and the cadets football would end up playing in 1943. But remember, I mentioned a lot of teams had to suspend their program? Well, dozens of them would actually be saved due to a new Navy program called the V5 and the V12 program, which was a prospective officer program that allowed a lot of varsity athletes to go to another school, train to be an officer, play football or play another sport at that school, and also saved them from going right into war, at least immediately. This improved a lot of teams in 1943 and also created a lot of service programs, which I went over in a 3-part video. You can actually check it out. I'll put a link above so you can hear more about those service programs that I'll be mentioning throughout the next 3 years or so. So since the V5 and V12 programs saved a lot of athletics on campuses during the 1942 and 1943 seasons, something else made Army a better football program and also a hotspot for transfers and high school players to want to go to. The reason was that if you were a football player aged 18 or above, you really wanted to go to Army right now because you could train to be a career Army officer, which would save you from going right into battle. And if you did graduate while war was still going on, you wouldn't initially go to the battlefields. This wouldn't be a hot topic for players until the 1942 season because, again, the thick of World War II was going on and no one knew how it was going to end up, and you kind of wanted to save your own life at this point. Because of that, Army would gain a lot of transfers. One of those big ones I'll be mentioning throughout the next couple of years was kicker Dick Walterhouse. Another thing that made Army a hotspot for athletes was that the weight and height requirements were out of the window when Blaik Blaik was hired. Blaik initially really didn't want to take the Army job due to the height and weight requirements that were put on the books in 1931. The requirements were that no cadet could weigh more than 208 pounds unless they were 6'4" or taller, and no one under 6 feet tall could weigh more than 176 pounds. That sounds crazy for a football team right now, especially in college. Maybe a high school team, but most of them have some players over 208 pounds. Blaik came in and he got those requirements changed to allowing players to weigh as much as 228 pounds, which again, still sounds pretty low, especially to weights nowadays. But the change to 228 pounds was only allowed as long as your height and weight wasn't as a result of obesity, but of athletic build, because Army officers had to be in top physical conditioning. Going into the 1943 season, Army had a good dose of transfers, as well as a good nucleus from the previous season, being Tom Lombardo and Doug Kenna. They were running the ball as well as being quarterbacks, shuffling in and out. They also had eventual All-American Kaz Myslinski on the line. 1943 started great as they were 5-0. They beat Columbia and Yale, but then they tied Penn before meeting number 1 Notre Dame in New York City. And the 1943 Notre Dame team might be one of the best teams ever, as they beat pretty much every top team this year, including Army 26-0. And Army would be 7-1-1 going into their finale versus Navy, got shut out 13-0. And Army improved every year under Blaik, but they still couldn't get past Notre Dame and Navy. But coming off that 7-win season for the first time in the 1940s, Blaik was looking at the 1944 season being his best team, as he was bringing back a lot of starters as well as bringing in a lot of great new players. And I'll get to those new ones in just a moment, but let's go back over into who is coming back to this team. One of those was the quarterback halfback, but mostly quarterback. His name was Doug Kenna. Kenna was from Jackson, Mississippi, and originally went to Ole Miss during his freshman year in 1941, but then when war broke out, he received an appointment from West Point and was on his way to New York. Kenna would be a halfback and also sometimes quarterback during the 1943 season, sharing time with another player that was coming back, and also being named captain this year in Tom Lombardo. Lombardo was born and raised in St. Louis, and he was also chosen MVP of the city of St. Louis in football in 1940. He would graduate and eventually matriculate to the local college St. Louis University and play basketball there, but not football, as there was no team playing there in 1941. But the minimal athletics he did do got him noticed by a colonel at West Point, and by the end of 1942 spring semester, with World War II fully underway, the colonel at West Point played an important role in getting Lombardo to West Point, like giving Lombardo a glowing recommendation, which was one of the main things you needed to get into West Point. Lombardo did play, but he wasn't really like a big-time starter. Again, he was mostly sharing time with Doug Kenna and about 6 other running backs. But he was more well known for being one of the most stand-up and well-respected players and also people at West Point. Because of that, he was elected captain before the 1944 season. Playing in front of those two were returners to the offensive line like John Green. He played at Tulane in 1942 before getting a much-needed appointment to West Point in 1943. Along with Green playing on offense and defense and coming back for his senior season was Dale Hall. Hall was an All-American in basketball twice and ended up coaching at Army about a dozen years later, but one of the biggest returning starters that not a lot of people knew about until 1944 was Glenn Davis. Davis was from California and played along with his brother Ralph in high school, and it would carry on into college as they both went to West Point. Glenn was the more talented one, and it showed as he had some big runs in 1943, but he ran into a lot of academic troubles as he couldn't get used to the academic rigors and the military rigors at the school. During and after the 1943 season, he really got the academics under control and would end up coming into the 1944 season as a full-fledged starter. But going back to Blaik, he was really big not only on getting those weight requirements changed, but also recruiting all over the country. For that, he needed to hire some great assistants, and he would do that as he would hire Andy Gustafson and also Bob Woodruff. Both of them would also become great coaches in their own right. Another assistant coach he would hire was Herman Hickman. He was a rather unknown line coach in the South, but he was more well known for recruiting great talent and also one that knew where to find great talent. And he was the one that ended up finding and pushing to get Felix Doc Blanchard to West Point. Blanchard was out of South Carolina, and he would be a star throughout high school, taking his team in Bay St. Louis, Mississippi to an undefeated record in 1941. During his high school years, he was recruited by Army, but he didn't want to go there because he didn't think he could pass the entrance exam. So he went to University of North Carolina, where Jim Tatum was coaching there at the time, and he was also Blanchard's mother's cousin. Blanchard wouldn't play varsity in 1942 due to freshmen not being able to play varsity during that time, but he wouldn't really see too much playing time anyway because there weren't too many freshman teams. After the 1942 freshman season, he would enlist, but instead go to New Mexico, where he would work in a chemical warfare unit and never be shipped overseas. Blanchard, however, wasn't really a big fan of this, so he called home to his father, who was a renowned doctor and also a former football player in South Carolina and Mississippi, and his father would call Hickman for advice. Hickman's advice was easy: get Blanchard to West Point. The only thing that the Blanchards would have to do, though, would be to get a congressman to co-sign Blanchard into West Point. Fortunately, the elder Blanchard knew of a congressman who would co-sign on, and Felix Doc Blanchard was into West Point just in time for the 1944 season. This could have gone down differently, as at University of North Carolina, Blanchard could have stayed at University of North Carolina after the 1942 season due to the V12 program coming to the UNC campus. This would have allowed Blanchard to finish his studies and play football there, but he would also be trained as a Navy officer, so this would mean that Blanchard could have been playing on a Navy team or the Navy squad itself against Army in the 1944 and 45 seasons. Along with Blanchard, Army would also get a talented runner and quarterback in Arnold Tucker. He would start more in 1945, but he would play a lot in 1944. Along with Tucker, they also got Barney Poole, who was a talented end who played on a freshman squad at UNC with Blanchard, and both were from Mississippi, so it gave Blanchard a friend to room with. So with that influx of new talent, Blaik would think of a new idea that really isn't crazy right now, but was pretty inventive at the time, and that was to use two different squads. He would have a squad of upperclassmen, and the other being made up of newer players. While one was playing the offense, the other would play defense, and it would rotate every quarter. This allowed his squad to be a little more rested throughout the season, and it allowed for all of these talented players to get on the field. Alright, so there you go. Broke down pretty much all of the big players on this 1944 season, so let's finally get to the 1944 season. It would start with a 4-game stretch at home. First, it started with the University of North Carolina, and UNC was a totally different squad in 1944, as they nearly lost their entire squad from the year before, which went 6-3, as most of them were V12 players and either graduated or were shipped off. Plus, this game had more of a story due to Poole and Blanchard playing on the freshman team only 2 years earlier. And this game started, and it was totally lopsided, as UNC couldn't score or really do anything at all, as they only had 14 yards rushing and 21 passing yards the entire game. Meanwhile, Army was running all over the place, and one of those players running all over the place was a new full-fledged starter in Glenn Davis, as he had 3 touchdowns in this game and 125 rushing yards. Blanchard, meanwhile, didn't really do all that much rushing, only carrying the ball 4 times for under 20 yards, but he was averaging almost 20 yards on each of his kickoff returns, and he did manage to score on a lateral from Barney Poole late in the game. The final was 46-0, and UNC would go on to be 1-7-1, getting shut out in 6 games, so it was clear of this team's depleted talent roster. Army would go into their second game versus Brown, and it would be on a hot October day as only 6,000 people would show up to see more Army domination, and due to their domination, Davis and Blanchard only played half the game, and even with half the game, Davis still managed to score 3 times again. 1 on a rushing touchdown, 1 on a passing touchdown, and then 1 on a punt return touchdown. Blanchard, meanwhile, was still getting used to the offense. He did only have 8 carries, but he averaged 8 yards per carry. The final was 59-7, and the papers across the country started to take more note of Blaik's team, and especially Davis. Keeping it going with an interesting game as Pitt would come to town, and Pitt knew of Blanchard and Davis quite well because Pitt's coach, Clark Shaughnessy, saw them both years earlier and told Blaik that Davis and Blanchard would both be starters on any college team in high school, pretty much as a 17-year-old. Another reason was that Blaik started to use the T formation for his offense, which was perfected by Shaughnessy. Shaughnessy's prediction was pretty much fulfilled in this game, as Army scored 69 points, and Blanchard finally showed off this week as he scored 2 times on a passing touchdown from Lombardo and also an interception return for a touchdown, and he only played 22 minutes in this game. Davis, meanwhile, had 161 rushing yards on 9 carries. That's insane. Also, he completed 2 passes for 118 yards, and he only scored 1 somehow. It's just insane to think of the stats these guys were putting up already. Pitt obviously couldn't stop them, as Army had over 600 yards of total offense, which was unheard of at the time, and they won 69-7. So Game 4 is kind of like when Bama plays an FCS team late in the year, because Army played the Coast Guard in this game, and Blanchard would only play 12 minutes in this game, but he would still end up scoring 2 times. Davis scored twice too, but he only played half the game. One player that did get a lot of time on the field though in this game was Dick Walterhouse, as he came out for 11 extra points, which was a record at the time, and he kicked 10 through the uprights. Army still managed to have 443 yards in this game rushing, 157 passing yards, which is also insane, for another 600-yard performance, and this was mostly with reserves and backups because, like I mentioned, they didn't play Davis or Blanchard after the half, and they still thrashed the Coast Guard 76-0. So now Army's 4-0 after pretty much beating down every single opponent, and they would now have to travel for their first game. It wasn't really an away game as much, as they went to the Polo Grounds in New York City to play Duke. Duke was coming off an 8-1 Southern Conference title season, and also their football and basketball coach was back on the sidelines this season to coach them, in Eddie Cameron. Duke's roster wasn't as depleted as other teams, but they still couldn't beat some of those top teams like Navy and Penn, so they were 1-3 coming into this game. Duke played Army tough because Army wouldn't score until the second quarter on a 53-yard run by Davis, but Walterhouse missed the extra point. That would be significant because Duke would score before the half, and it gave Army the first time they would have a deficit going into the half. The deficit didn't last long though, as Army would abandon the pass and run for 3 touchdowns. 1 by Blanchard and 1 by Dale Hall. He didn't really have many, so I just wanted to mention him. Duke didn't score the rest of this game, and Army managed to win 27-7, mostly with that breakout third quarter. After their first tough win, Army would pretty much have a week off of sorts as they played Villanova. Villanova was 5-3 last year, but they lost to Army 27-0, and their roster was even more depleted due to their V12 players leaving. Villanova still managed to somehow come into this game 4-1, but they were mostly wins over much smaller schools, and also in all of those wins, Villanova only scored 14 points, so they weren't winning by much. Blaik saw how Villanova was, and he knew this was pretty much going to be an easy win. He knew it was going to be so easy that he didn't even stay for the game, as he left the day before with Hickman and a few other coaches to watch and scout the Navy-Notre Dame game, which was happening on the same day. So without Blaik and Hickman and a few other coaches, Andy Gustafson, the backfield coach, would end up coaching this game. Also, some other people not playing in this game would be Doc Blanchard, as he sprained his knee the previous week, so he wouldn't play, but Glenn Davis would play, and he would score 3 times. The game had 9-minute quarters in the second half because Army was winning so badly, but it didn't really matter because Dick Walterhouse still had to kick 11 extra points as Army cruised to an easy 83-0 win, and they were now 6-0. But Blaik was back on campus after the Villanova game, and there was a reason, because the last 3 games would pretty much be their toughest 3 games. First, they were traveling to New York City again, but instead of going to the Polo Grounds, they were going to Yankee Stadium to play the team that Blaik was scouting the previous week in number 5 Notre Dame. Notre Dame was a very different team from the previous year, as they didn't have their national championship coach Frank Leahy. Along with a new coach, they also lost many of their V12 players and their Heisman winner Angelo Bertelli, but they still had a strong team with 2 future All-Americans as well as a future NFLer in Frank Dantzwitz. With all the changes on the team, Notre Dame started strong with a 5-0 record and scoring over 20 points per game, but then they ran into Navy, and Navy crushed them the previous week, and even though Notre Dame wasn't the same team from the previous year, it didn't matter to Army because they had to beat Notre Dame. They hadn't beaten them since 1931, and they were shut out the previous 2 years. The game would be played in front of a sold-out crowd at Yankee Stadium with 76,000 in attendance, and it wasn't much of a game. Notre Dame won the toss, and Army sent out Blanchard to kick the ball, and he did so, out of the end zone, putting Notre Dame at their own 20. The game was Army domination pretty much from that point, as they scored 3 touchdowns with 1 passing and 1 rushing by Doug Kenna. Along with that, Kenna also intercepted a pass, and then Blanchard intercepted 2 passes. In the second quarter, Glenn Davis got into the action by intercepting a Notre Dame pass, and then scoring shortly thereafter, and they did all of this before halftime, by the way, and the score at halftime was 33-0. At halftime, the 2,500 cadets were making a roar while the Notre Dame fans were silent, and some were leaving at this point. The second half was pretty much more of the same, as Army had pretty much all of their reserves in by the fourth quarter, but Glenn Davis still managed to score again after an interception return for a touchdown. Army kept intercepting passes all the way through the end of the game, as they intercepted Notre Dame 8 times in this game. The final score was 59-0, and it was the most points that Army had scored on Notre Dame in the last 5 contests combined. Army was now 7-0, and Glenn Davis had 12 touchdowns through this season through 7 games and had 27 total since he started playing at Army last year. Their second to last game of the season involved Army heading out of New York and going to Philly to play Penn. And this game was significant, as the Army-Penn game from 1940 was the reason that Blaik was hired. The reason was because Penn crushed Army by more than 40 points in this game, and Blaik was a rising coach at Dartmouth, but Army had an unwritten rule that only Army officers at the school could coach the team. Blaik was obviously not an Army officer as he was working at Dartmouth, but there was another rule that was rewritten for him, and he was hired, and Blaik would eventually rise to the ranking of colonel at the academy. So the game didn't start like other games, as it started quite slow, as Penn kept Army far away from the goal line throughout most of the first quarter, but also Penn couldn't do anything either. The tie would be broken when Max Minor and Army would run for a 68-yard touchdown, but then Penn would rebound after they scooped up a fumble and run it back for a touchdown. And that was all that Penn did, as Army took over and would score 49 straight points and run away with this game. Blanchard and Davis wouldn't make their presence known until the second and third quarter, as Blanchard would score in the second and he would score twice in the third, while Glenn Davis scored once in each quarter. And Army were having their reserves in for most of the fourth quarter, as the game ended 62-7. Army was now 8-0, and they were now ranked the number 1 team, with many people calling them the greatest team ever. And Army would show that they were the best team, as they would face the second best team this year, at least in the rankings, in Navy. Navy was coming into this game 6-2, as they lost to North Carolina pre-flight, which was one of the better service teams this year, who had tons of players with college football experience, and also having to play against a defense which was coached by Bear Bryant. Navy's other loss was a bigger upset, as they lost to Georgia Tech, which was another team that benefited from having V5 and V12 students at their school. Now, Navy's wins were pretty much over the same teams that Army beat, like Notre Dame, Duke, and also Penn. Navy was led this season by Oscar Hagberg. He was a former Navy player and assistant that stepped in to coach the team during the war, while he was also commanding submarines. And Navy was like Army in that they gained a lot of really good players from other schools looking to avoid the draft, one of those being All-American tackle Don Whitmire, who played at Bama before the war, and who was famous from the 1943 Army-Navy game, as he started a few fights during that game. Whitmire blocked the running back and also another All-American, Bobby Jenkins, as well as a future Olympian, Clyde Scott. With Navy having 3 All-Americans playing and Army having 4, this game consisted of over 60% of the All-American selections this season, and the game, like last year, had some wartime travel restrictions, so they played it at home base, except this time they played it at Navy's home field in Baltimore. And since this game was being played in Baltimore in late November, this game was cold, and it also had some snowfall as well. And the cold and wet grass contributed to some injuries that happened early in this game. One was by the Navy running back and All-American Bobby Jenkins, who was coming into this game hurt anyway, as he had a hurt toe, and then he took a hit from 2 Army players early in this game, and he was out for pretty much the entire rest of the game. That injury and the field conditions slowed down both teams, as neither team got past the 50 until the second quarter. The scoring would eventually come in the second quarter after Army intercepted a Navy pass. It would only take a few plays before Army used a fake handoff to Glenn Davis and instead went to Dale Hall, who ran it in and made it 6-0. The rest of the first half was a brutal game with many hits and injuries, as another Navy All-American, their tackle Don Whitmire, got injured. The Navy line was supposed to be the best, and actually better than Army, so an injury only helped Army more in this game. Army got a safety early in the third quarter, but then Navy went on a 73-yard drive to cut the score down to 9-7. But after that, Army, and especially Davis and Blanchard, took over, with Davis starting with an interception in the fourth quarter before Blanchard was given the ball, and he went inside and broke through the Navy line for his first touchdown of the game to make it 16-7. The game was further out of reach when Davis took a carry from the 31-yard line, faked a Navy player, ran around a few others, and then went for the touchdown to make it 23-7. There were only minutes left and Navy couldn't answer, so Army won and completed their perfect season in style. Now, Army was not the only undefeated team this season, as Ohio State went 9-0, and they also had the Heisman winner Les Horvath on the team. But Army had an outstanding scoring advantage, as they outscored teams 56-4, while Ohio State scored just about half of what Army did. Glenn Davis this season had some amazing numbers. He only had 58 rushing attempts this season, but he scored on 14 of them. He would also score on 6 touchdowns through the air, so he had 20 this season. Blanchard, meanwhile, only did half of what Davis did, but also he's new to the team. He still managed to score 9 touchdowns with 6 rushing and 3 receiving, as well as average 5.5 yards per carry. The team would lose some players after the 1944 season due to them graduating and going off to war. Doug Kenna, one of Army's quarterbacks, was recruited by the general, George Patton, to coach teams in occupied Germany after the war. Other quarterback was Tom Lombardo, who was also the captain of this team. After the war, he would be shipped off to Japan, as well as also Korea, for the next 6 years or so. Unfortunately though, Lombardo was looking like he was going to be a lifer in the Army, but then he was killed in battle in the Korean War in 1950. Lombardo's death in battle was unfortunate. He is well remembered for being one of the most outstanding cadets at Army during this time. He was captain on this team, so just a fantastic player, so that's why I wanted to make sure I mentioned Lombardo. But that was just the end of year 1 of this streak, and it was one of the best years in college football. I'm going to be having part 2 coming out next week, where I'm going to be covering the 1945 season, which had a lot of changes involved with that. So again, make sure you subscribe to the channel, please. Ring the bell below, like this video, and share this video, please, with your friends. And as always, have a fantastic day, guys.